From Asia Society Switzerland, this is State of Asia. We're back with a new series of engaging conversations with leading minds on issues that shape Asia and affect us all. My name is Remco Tanis. Today I'm speaking with iconic veteran of diplomacy, Bilahari Kausikan, former ambassador and permanent secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Singapore. Bilahari explains why he's not unhopeful about the state of the world, the fundamental dilemma facing China, and how, as a small country, you can still have agency on the global stage. This fall, Bilahari will be in Switzerland. On November 21st, he will deliver our annual State of Asia address at the prestigious Aula of the University of Zurich. He will also speak at the State of Asia conference the next day. More info on how to get tickets to both events is on our website. A link is in the show notes. Bilahari Kausikan spent 37 years working for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Singapore. In that time, he served in a variety of appointments at home and abroad, including as ambassador to the Russian Federation, permanent representative to the UN in New York, and as the permanent secretary to the ministry. Raffles Institution, the University of Singapore, and Columbia University in New York have, as he puts it, all attempted to educate him. Throughout his career, he was known as a diplomat who does not mince his words. And he still doesn't. Bilahari Kausikan, welcome to State of Asia.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
I was watching a video of the book launch of your latest book, The Updated Singapore is Still Not an Island, a collection of your op-ed speeches, etc. The book was launched this summer in July. At the launch event, one of your former colleagues, Ambassador Ong Keng-yong, said, "We're all very happy when Bilahari retired, thinking we would get some reprieve from him." Why did he say that, do you think?
It was a joke.
Mm.
It was a joke. I was their permanent secretary, so I guess I drove them a little hard.
You have the reputation of being quite straightforward. Is that right?
I find it's simpler that way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there is a misconception about diplomats that you should speak obliquely, you should be circumlocuitous in your expression and so on. I find that usually causes much more trouble. It's much simpler to speak clearly and plainly rather than to be misunderstood and then have to correct things. Of course, it doesn't mean that you have to be rude, but as somebody once said, a diplomat is somebody who is not rude accidentally. In other words, diplomacy is not just about being nice, agreeable, pleasant, and so on. It is about advancing your country's interests, preferably by being nice, agreeable, pleasant, but if necessary, by whatever works.
The definition of being diplomatic is, like you say, to be very prudent. Why is that?
It's misleading. It's extremely misleading. Well, I think diplomats should not go around poking other countries in the eye, right? As I said, but your fundamental job is only the poorer sort of diplomat and those who don't get very far in their careers. Who think that being pleasant is the end of diplomacy. It's a means. So your end of diplomacy is to advance your country's interests, preferably by being pleasant about it. But if necessary, by being tough, by being unyielding, and if necessary, by being rude. As I said, a diplomat is never rude by accident.
You used that word accident again. And I read an interview with you last year where you said, well, I started at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Singapore by accident. You first tried academic career, journalism a bit. Why is it by accident? Was it really not in your planning to start this career 37 years ago?
No, actually, no. I wanted at first to be an academic, and I got a scholarship from the US government to do a PhD at Columbia University in New York. And then one day, after I got through, the PhD program in the US is a very long, drawn-out, tedious process. I think they adopted it from the Germans. That's why it's long, drawn out, and tedious. Okay, all right. You have to do a lot of irrelevant things before you get to doing whatever you want to. Anyway, I got through all the qualifying stuff, and I was writing my dissertation.
Mhm.
And one day it was an autumn day, so the days were growing shorter, and I emerged from the bowels of Low Memorial Library when I had an epiphany. The epiphany was, I haven't seen the damn sun for more than a week because, the days are short. By the time I went to the library, it was still dark. By the time I got out, it was dark. And I asked myself, do I really want to do this for the rest of my life or some variant of it? And the answer was obviously no. So I quit. I went back, and the deal was that they gave me the scholarship. I was supposed to go and serve in the university for some time. But I said I don't want. My career goals have changed, and they asked. And after to cut a long story short, they said, "Where do you want to go?" And I without thinking too much of it, said the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then I stayed there 37 years, always forgetting to leave. I forgot to leave because I was having fun and I thought I was doing all right.
Right. You've been ambassador in quite a few interesting places. The UN, of course, Moscow. What if when you first get to a place like that as an ambassador, how do you get to know the place? How do you get to feel like you mentioned at the beginning? I'm a diplomat, but I like to not poke them in the eyes, but still be clear in my intentions. How do you do that?
Well, first of all, you should start trying to get to know the place before you arrive there
Hmm.
by reading and so on, reading not just the files, but reading widely. It helps that I don't have too many hobbies except walking and reading, and a beer now and then, which you can do with while reading. So when you get there, I think any diplomat is, the first thing you should do is to meet as many people as possible. Not just people in the foreign ministry, but as many people outside government, people in the man in the street. And you should walk the streets. I am a great believer in learning a country through the soles of your feet. Walking around, poking around in odd corners, and just absorbing things by osmosis. I find that's a common mistake among many diplomats from many countries. They spend too much time with their colleagues and not enough time with their host country people.
You also said you have to view the world as it is, not as you hope or fear it to be.
Yes.
How is the world now?
The world is in, well, I don't think you are in Europe, right? The war in Ukraine and US China strategic competition has made the world an uncertain and unpredictable place. That's for sure. But is this something unusual? I beg to differ that it's unusual. I think this is usual. The competition between states and the possibility of competition turning into conflict is inherent as part of international relations since time immemorial. If you look at the 20th century, it was a century of almost continuous conflict, much more than, say, the 19th century, 18th century, 17th century. Go back as far as you want in history, right? And it's inherent in the nature of international relations and perhaps in something very dark in human nature. But this harsh reality was masked for a relatively short period, maybe 20 years or so, from 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down and the Cold War ended, by the overwhelming dominance of the United States for a short period. In the immediate aftermath of the Berlin Wall coming down, the Soviet Union and then Russia was in an extremely incoherent state of affairs, and it was not in a position to play any role. 1989 was also the year Tiananmen happened in China, and the Chinese were internally preoccupied. They are always internally preoccupied more than usual. It had not yet begun to grow in earnest. That only happened in the 1990s and the early 2000s. So that was a very exceptional and historically short period of history, and we have now returned to a more normal period of world history.
You mentioned this great power competition, US China tensions. I want to get back to that, but first, the war in Ukraine. I'm talking to you from Europe. You're viewing the world from Southeast Asia, from Singapore. Do we in Europe see the war in Ukraine as too big a thing? It's a major thing, of course, but too big a thing compared to if it were to happen in another region of the world?
Yeah, I think so. Look, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is certainly a very egregious violation of some very fundamental principles. In other words, if I don't like what you're doing and I'm bigger than you, I am not supposed to rearrange your face by force. Okay. But is it unusual? I don't think so. How is it different from the American invasion of Iraq, the American interventions supported by Europeans, by the way, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Syria? How is it different? Except that it's happening in Europe. And even, don't forget, even in that rather unusual period of world history, 20 years or so, there were vicious conflicts in the Balkans, which is in Europe. The last time I checked the map, there were vicious genocidal conflicts in Rwanda, in Africa, and that's when the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan began. And even if you look around the world today, conflict is rife. And so why is this different? I understand if the Europeans consider it different because it's right on your borders, right? That's quite understandable. But my point is really, I think Europe in general would do well to speak more about interests and less about as if this is a clash of values. It is to some degree a clash of values, but really, there were other clash of values in which you didn't make such a big fuss because they seem far away, right? But in principle, the principle is the same. And that's why I think you should be aware that support for the war in Ukraine, I mean, the global south understands the principles involved, but they do see double standards. They do see a certain amount of hypocrisy. Now, mind you, I believe double standards and hypocrisy are inherent in international relations too. I think you'll be better served instead of talking about grand principles like this is a contest between democracy and autocracy, say that my interests are affected, that people can understand better.
Last year, we spoke with James Crabtree in an interview. You mentioned to manage geopolitical competition, we have to keep our sense of hard headed clinical realism, which I fear is being lost, is how you were quoted.
Yeah.
And you said, and that is, I fear that's being lost partly because we had an outbreak of democracy in Southeast Asia and foreign policy gets contaminated by sentimental considerations.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate? I don't believe you're opposed to democracy,
No, I'm not.
but why did you put it that way, that we are troubled by an outbreak of democracy in Southeast Asia?
I put it that way partly for effect. I'm not against democracy, of course, right? And I'm not nostalgic for an earlier period when there were autocracies throughout Southeast Asia of different degrees. But I think you have to understand that there are different degrees and different types of democracy too. And whatever the type, democracy in its simplest meaning means you got to win elections. And you got to win elections means that you got to do things that may not be in your foreign policy interests. Most people in most countries aren't particularly interested in foreign policy. That's true of Singapore, that's true of Switzerland, it's true of most countries you can think of. And so you can't take a clinical view anymore. Every foreign policy has to rest on a strong domestic consensus. Now, once upon a time, that domestic consensus was a few people. Now it is pretty much the entire population, including in communist countries like Vietnam and Laos, because they have become more pluralistic. You can't rule in the old ways. Your populations have become more educated, they are more exposed to the world, so you have to rule in a different way. But the fact is that contaminates the clinical calculation of your interests. Now, that's true in Europe. For a long time, until you had a huge shock about Ukraine, right? For a long time, all European countries, maybe not Switzerland because you have a different system. I mean, I'm talking about EU countries and members of NATO, right? They neglected their defense spending. Their ability to deter eroded drastically. That is so because the European social model, of which they are rightly very proud and which forms a very large part of European identity, is not sustainable as a matter of demographic certainty. But it's very hard to cut social spending, politically hard, I mean. So what do? You cut defense spending. Because who's going to complain about that except for a few professional soldiers, and who the hell cares of what they think? In other words, they cashed in a peace dividend, which I think is largely mythical anyway, given the nature of international relations. They mistook that historically short and abnormal period for the norm and acted accordingly because it was the electorally easy thing to do. And now they're paying a price. So that's what I mean by clinical realism being eroded. Because if you were clinically real, you would say, okay, you look around the world, it says, okay, good. I'm glad that the immediate tensions of the Cold War have ended. But is this a fundamentally different world? As the nature of international relations fundamentally changed? And if you took a clinical view of things, you would certainly, in my view, concluded no. We are not quite in that same dire situation in Southeast Asia, because I don't think we ever thought that there was a peace dividend, all right? But the general dynamic of which this is one example does pertain. Can't be helped, because the world is becoming more pluralistic.
If we look at, for example, just recently, we saw the BRICS meeting in South Africa, where they invited 5 other countries to join. I read a piece in the Financial Times that said, well, the only mortar holding the BRICS together is a grievance against the West. Is grievance a useful tool in foreign policy?
I don't think, I think I read that same Financial Times article. I think it overstated the case. Let's start from first principles. How did the term BRICS arise? It arose from a fund manager as a slogan designed to part the unwary from their money. It was not a geopolitical concept, and it's still not a coherent geopolitical concept. That said, I think they use the word grievance is to overstate the case, as columnists often do, because they need eyeballs. I would say that the BRICS represents a mood among the global south, rather than any real convergence of interests. Okay, let me try to describe the mood. I think the mood is that we have long gone from the days when the West, meaning North America, Europe, can be the only determinant of the rules of international relations. But if you look at even with the expansion, right, which are the only 2 countries in the BRICS which have real deep grievances against the present international order? Probably only Russia and Iran. Even China is one of the major beneficiaries of the current order. So it has certain resentments. India has certain resentments. Saudi Arabia, you name it, Brazil, they are part of the international order. They may not like this bit or that bit, but to use the word grievance is too much. But The general idea I agree with. This is not a coherent geopolitical grouping, right? It is a reflection of a certain mood, and it will not go too far. It will not amount to very much. The original BRICS didn't amount to very much. Neither will expansion. Expansion will only make it more incoherent. But look at the new structures in my part of the world. Who created the Quad and who created AUKUS? It was Mr. Xi Jinping. Who revitalized NATO? It was Mr. Putin. And this is also a very fundamental dynamic of international relations. If countries feel threatened, they will seek out other countries with similar threat perceptions and see what they can do together. I don't think America created a Quad. American diplomacy would be not capable of doing it if there was not this sense of common threat. I don't think America. How many American presidents have tried to get the EU to take their own defense seriously? They all failed. It's Mr. Putin who did it. You should put up a small bust to Mr. Putin in NATO headquarters.
You said Xi Jinping is the worst foreign policy emperor China has ever had. Is that
In recent times, anyway, in ancient times they were far worse ones.
sure?
All right. All right. Look. You look at. Cast your mind back to the Beijing Summer Olympics in 2008. China was riding high throughout the world. Yes, there were some problems over human rights issues like Tibet and so on. But by and large, everybody admired China. Right now, you look around the world. I can't think of any country, including some that are very dependent on China, that don't have concerns about one aspect or the other of Chinese behavior. How is this a successful foreign policy? A couple of years ago, Mr. Xi Jinping himself told a group of his cadres that they must make China more lovable, more respectable, and widen its circle of friends. Now, that seems to me to be something of an admission that it is not lovable. It's not quite respected. Its reputation is certainly better in the global south than in the global north. But the fact is, most of China's economic interests are in the global north, not in the global south. In the global south, it's a market, but these are generally poor countries, and you need rich countries to have good markets. They are the sources of the technologies you need and which you are being cut off from in some areas are in the global north. I think Mr. Xi Jinping made two fundamental mistakes. First, he didn't start them, by the way. They started at the end of the Hu Jintao era, right after the global financial crisis. But I think there were two fundamental mistakes. First of all, they began to believe their own propaganda, that China's rise was unstoppable and the West's decline was not just relative, but absolute. And because of that fundamental mistake, they prematurely abandoned Deng Xiaoping's very wise policy of hiding your capabilities and biding your time. I don't think these things can be reversed, because the problem with prematurely showing your capabilities or your ambitions means that nobody's going to forget it after that, right? All right. So I think the main moves were made by Mr. Xi Jinping. In fact, I'll go further. Look at his internal governance, things that he started in the first 10 years of his rule. Can you name a single one that you can honestly call an unqualified success? There are no major failures, but there are no unqualified successes. Even his signature Belt and Road initiative, which I have never been too impressed by the way. Well, there's not so much boasting about it. They never abandoned it, of course, but many of these projects are not viable. Many of the credit that China has extended for in the global south for these projects, these are never going to be repaid. They were never going to be repaid. The Chinese are beginning to understand this. And you see China's economic situation right now. That is directly attributable to some fundamental things that did not occur under Mr. Xi Jinping.
You mentioned the economic situation we are reading a lot about now, of course, in China. And you said, well, China or Xi Jinping's one of his mistakes was he started to believe his own propaganda that the West is in decline.
Absolutely, Crime.
Absolute decline, yes. And now we're reading all these pieces and we're hearing all these stories about China, the economy going bad. Are we actually making the same mistake now, thinking it's going worse than it actually is? Is China much more resilient than we would want it to be?
Yeah, yes and no. Okay, yes, I think you should not indulge in wishful thinking and thinking that China is now in decline. It's not. It's quite a resilient system and it's quite a adaptive system. However, there is a fundamental issue that has been postponed and cannot be postponed indefinitely. I think China is reaching an inflection point. What you see in the property market, in local government debt, in the softness in the commercial banking sector, these are symptoms of a much more fundamental issue. In 2012, at the 18th Party Congress, the 18th Communist Party of China's Congress, The party itself acknowledged that the growth model that had given it spectacular results throughout the 1990s and in the first decade of the 2000s was not sustainable. That growth model basically was a very heavy emphasis on investment in infrastructure led by state-owned enterprises. And they acknowledged themselves that it is not sustainable. And the next year, 2013, they rolled out in some detail a new growth model that had at its center the promise to give the market a decisive role. That's their quote, a decisive role in the allocation of resources. In other words, more economic efficiency. Now, very little of that new growth model has been implemented. I've read some academic studies that suggest maybe no more than 15-20%. Now, why is this so? On the one hand, they acknowledge that their old growth model is not sustainable forever, and they have a new growth model, but they don't really implement it. I think it poses a fundamental dilemma to China, and that dilemma is this: China is, after all, a communist country. People forget that. Not in its ideology. You will probably find many more people who believe in class struggle in European universities, faculties, than in China. but but certainly in its political structure, it's a Leninist state in which the vanguard party is paramount. Now, what is the primary value of a Leninist party? It's control. Control not just of politics, but of state, society, economics, culture, everything. Now, more economic efficiency through the market means by definition less control. So you need a new balance between, it's not either or, of course, you need a new balance. How much control are you going to give up for how much more economic efficiency? But they haven't been able to find what that new balance is. In fact, under Xi Jinping, the movement has all been more party discipline, more party ideological discipline, more party control, including over the private sector, including over foreign companies operating in China. Recently, you see this contradiction, not just in the property weakness of the property sector and etc. You see Prime Minister Li Cheng saying that I want foreign investment, I need foreign investment, please come and invest, China is open for business. At the same time, you see this new espionage law that if we were having this discussion in China and one of us was Chinese, will get us both into deep trouble. And both, they are equally serious about both. They feel very insecure and they need the investment, but they can't find a new balance. That is the fundamental dilemma they face.
You, as a conscript in the Singapore military, served in Taiwan. Were trained in Taiwan for a bit.
Well, this is one of the worst kept secrets of Singapore. We won't admit it. I wouldn't have admitted it if I was in the government, even though everybody knew it. The Singapore Armed Forces does training in Taiwan.
I heard you talk about that and saying at the moment I'm seeing a decline in the willingness of Taiwan to defend itself, while at the same time its feeling of entitlement is growing. Like, I'm the only Chinese democracy, so other democracies, the West, come help me whenever the threat of China becomes too great. And you said I'm worried more about what I'm seeing happening in Taiwan, especially now with the elections coming up, than what I'm seeing happening in the mainland threat towards Taiwan. What did you mean by that?
Although the Chinese, the mainland, will never forswear the use of force against Taiwan, but I don't think forceful reunification is their preferred option. But there are red lines, and the trouble with those red lines is nobody really knows where they are, including the Chinese. So, as the volatility of Taiwanese politics could lead people in directions they really don't want to go. And right now, we are facing a convergence of two presidential elections. One is the Taiwanese one, of course, which will be sometime in January next year. But January next year is also when the primaries officially start in the United States. And the convergence of these two dynamics is something that I think we should be concerned about. Right now, I think the main risk, however, right now, is an accident getting out ahead. And that's the risk of the convergence of two presidential elections, because there are going to be people going to be saying and doing things that will cause a Chinese reaction, and then you have planes flying all over the place over the Taiwan Strait. The more activity is, by a matter of statistical probability, the risk of accident rises. And it's going to be difficult to keep an accident under control, because this is a terribly emotional issue for China, not just for the party, but I think for the Chinese population in general.
Singapore and Switzerland are quite close together in the lists of GDP and things like that. They're both small countries. They're both fairly independent, not belonging to, for example, in Switzerland's case, the EU or NATO. As a diplomat who has represented Singapore as a small nation, but an economically powerful nation and an important nation, what's good advice for diplomats from relatively small countries to get things done?
Well, I'll tell you what, I think Switzerland does it pretty well, actually. But I'll tell you what I always used to tell young officers when I was permanent secretary. And I think it's pretty much part of the corporate culture of the Singapore Foreign Ministry. If you're a small country, you got to start from the premise that you are irrelevant. So every day you wake up and you ask yourself, how do I make myself relevant? Now, there's no magic formula to relevance, because obviously what makes you relevant in one set of circumstances is irrelevant in another and may change over time. But first of all, I think you have to be economically successful. I keep telling people, my former colleagues, the young ones, if Singapore is successful, it's not merely because of their good looks and natural charm, and of course, brilliant intellects. It's because Singapore as a country is successful, and therefore people want to deal with you. Right? And they will deal with you on different terms than if you are, say, there asking for aid. It's easy to state this as a principle or as an approach, infinitely difficult to implement, because the implementation is going to be changing all the time, even as you do it, right? And I think that's what Switzerland does too. That's why Switzerland is a successful country. That's why the Swiss foreign policy has been successful, and for the Singapore foreign policy has been successful in a different way. What Singapore and Switzerland, I think, both show the world is that the smallest of country in the most dire of circumstances. Swiss circumstances these days are not so dire, but in the past it was pretty dire, right? And Singapore was born in the most dire circumstances. Is that however small you are, however terrible your circumstances, you have agency. You can do something. The most fatal thing to small states is a sense of fatalism. You can always do something.
You mentioned you sometimes talk with the young ones, the new generation of diplomats in the Singapore Foreign Ministry, and it reminds me of this song by a band from Chicago, and their lyric goes, "Every generation thinks it's the worst. It thinks it's the end of the world."
There is an element of truth in that song, because people's memories are short. That is why I think it's always important to keep a sense of perspective. In particular, yes, the world is uncertain now. There's a war on a scale we haven't seen for a long time in Europe. Strategic rivalry between the US and China is going to be a structural condition of international relations for the foreseeable future. But they are not unique, as I said. Competition is inherent in international relations. We have gone through periods of conflict before. In other words, yes, there are many uncertainties, but they are what the late Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense of the US, called known unknowns. We have navigated this before, and there's no reason why we can't navigate this again. In fact, Singapore not merely survived earlier uncertainties, which were in some ways far worse than present ones. When in 1965, the Cold War was very hot in Southeast Asia. And we did so, we not merely survived, but we prospered. And we did so with far less capabilities at our command than we today have. So as you keep calm, maintain a sense of perspective, and don't forget you always have agency. And this comes back to your democracy point. Get your internal politics right. There's no reason why we can't do it again.
That's hopeful.
I'm not unhopeful.
Okay, that's another way to put it. Bilahari Kausikan, thank you very much for joining us.
No, thank you for having me.
And we look forward to see you in November here in Zurich.
Okay, look forward to it. Let's have a drink.
I'm joined now by my colleagues of Asia Society Switzerland, Serena Jung and Nico Luxiger, to discuss what Bilahari addressed in the past 25 minutes of that conversation. If I can start at the end of that conversation, he said he was not unhopeful. We've navigated whatever we're seeing in the world, wars, crisis, tensions before. We've had far worse, and we survived. It's kind of a bleak way of being. Well, I said hopeful, he said not unhopeful. But I took weird comfort in that. How do either of you feel about that, Serena?
I like it. It agrees with my view of life and the world. But I also thought he made two very specific points that I just keep going back to, and they both start with A. So it's accidents and agency. And I think the two of them work their own ways, but they align and things just happen. And he explained it nicely because he said conflicts are inherent to relations. So I find it interesting as an outlook that he mentioned the Taiwanese elections and the US primaries, which raise probabilities of accidental conflict.
I'm a historian, so I always appreciate if people argue that we should keep historical perspective. On the other hand, I'm not sure if I find the argument very useful that we all should be fine and we should not complain or be worried because things were worse in the past, because the past many times was really, really, really bad. And I would like the present and especially the future to not just be not quite as bad as the past, but to be dramatically better. I don't think that's like an unreasonable hope to have.
We talked a bit about China. How can you not? And it kind of made me nostalgic. He referred to that period of 2008, the Olympics. Well, dare I say, peak China. It was lovable. It was respected mostly. But I did find it curious, and he addressed that as well. Now we're hearing all kinds of negative news from China. The economy is at tatters. Politically, well, we never really know what's happening, but it has seen at different times as well instability. If you look at the disappearance of certain ministers and things like that. But he said, well, we also shouldn't fall into the trap of wishful thinking here in the West, like he accused Xi Jinping specifically of believing his own propaganda, that the West is in absolute decline. At the same time, we here in the West shouldn't believe that China is maybe just losing it. It's a lot more resilient than we take it for granted to be. It kind of gave me an impatient feeling. I can't wait to see where we are in a few years, but I guess we have to wait. What's your take on that, Nico?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there he's spot on, and it's something that I've been almost a bit worried about in recent months, is that I think we're, again, way, way too quick to adopt the specific China narrative. And that seems to be something that I'm sure we do this as a society for other things that are not China, but it's just kind of, I notice it most with China, is that, I mean, if you look back again over just a few years, we've moved through so many of these, right? From the China will never catch up to us and all they can do is copy, to, then at some point China will inevitably overtake us and, we should be super scared because they're crazy smart authoritarians that can have technology that can do whatever they want. And neither of these two interpretations was true. They all had like a kernel of truth, probably. But then now, sort of China's growth having slowed down, which was both inevitable and there were many people that had sort of seen this coming. So I don't think it's completely surprising. And all of a sudden, we're, sort of like, you see people interpreting that this is kind of, it's the end of China or it's peak China, and it's kind of ultimate proof again that authoritarian regimes cannot be economically successful for the long term. We just don't know. We really don't know. And I think generally it's probably a good rule to not bet too heavily against the Chinese economy. And by the way, I think anybody in the West who cares about everyone's well-being and the general betterment of the world, I think should not hope for that. If the Chinese economy is doing badly, that's bad news for everyone, not just for Xi Jinping. There's this kind of element of glee sometimes in the analysis that I find very, very irritating.
And the latest story about the concerns about the Chinese economy are in parallel to the latest BRICS movement, which is already also fired up by this fear. Oh, these are the antagonistic forces joining together against the West. And I liked his description that it's more of a mood and that most of them, except for Russia and Iran, are part of the international order and dependent on them and contributing to it. So
that was really one of the most interesting things Bilahari talked about, and I agree that I really like this description of sort of BRICS being sort of the expression of a mood. I think he said resentment. There is, in a number of non-Western countries, there is a certain resentment, a certain dissatisfaction by, in their view, not having enough say, enough power within sort of the current international system. But at the same time, I don't think any of them have sort of a coherent alternative, right? So it's not that they have an alternative international system that they would like to implement. And that's partially because of what Serena said, is because they actually kind of have benefited quite hugely from the current system, but also because maybe, there's no kind of like systemic coherence among these countries. And I think that's kind of an interesting situation. And I do think that's one of the reasons what makes a difference from a Cold War scenario where you had two clear and ideologically different opposing blocs. And here it's a much more sort of diffuse resentment, dissatisfaction that's not yet clearly targeted towards a specific change or a specific goal.
I mean, you only have to look at India, who's part of BRICS and the Quad, which was also...
the SCO and the G20 and all of them.
Exactly. And I mean, that's the other part of the agency thing, which I found really interesting, that the Quad and AUKUS came to life or into being by Xi Jinping's actions, or NATO was revitalized by Russia.
That's all for this episode. Remember to grab your chance to hear directly from Bilahari in person, as he uses his almost 4 decades of experience in international diplomacy to craft our annual State of Asia address, which he will deliver on November 21st in Zurich. The next day, Bilahari will join other leading experts at our State of Asia conference, providing insights and discussion on key developments shaping Asia and affecting us all. A link to more information on both events is in the show notes. That's where you'll also find links to details on all our other upcoming events, on how to become a member of Asia Society Switzerland, and on other ways to support us. Our next episode, out in 2 weeks, features Alexander Gabuev, director of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center. Alexander is also a speaker at our conference in November. Be sure to subscribe to State of Asia to catch that conversation and the many others we have planned for this season. My name is Remco Tanes. Thanks for listening.